Bloomsbury in central London is home to one of the country's most famous national institutions. Established in 1753, the British Museum is one of the oldest museums in the world. Inside these walls, there are more than 7 million objects spanning over 2 million years of global history and culture. At the top of these stairs is some of the greatest treasure ever found on English soil. More than 1,000 years old, some call it page 1 of British history. It is the Sutton Hoo Treasure, with this helmet at its centre.
It is the prime example of a superb helmet. It's something that is completely extraordinary in Anglo-Saxon England.
It's also at once familiar because it is a face and we can see it's a helmet, and yet very strange, very other.
It's a world of dragons and monsters, and the face is just behind it in the darkness of the cheek pieces.
That the helmet was ever discovered at all was down to the efforts of one woman, Mrs. Edith Pretty, the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. She had lived at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk with her husband, a retired colonel, since 1926. 12 years later, she was widowed with a young son and had withdrawn from polite society.
Mrs. Pretty was interested in spiritualism, like a lot of people were in the 1930s. And we know that she had a friend who was a medium, and she used to go to meetings in Woodbridge with spiritualists. And there is a story that either her or a friend of hers had visions of soldiers with spears walking around on the mounds, which she could see from her first floor window.
Whatever the truth of these rumours, these earthen mounds were certainly intriguing.
I think Mrs. Pretty was just curious about what was in the mounds on her estate. She'd been to Egypt, and also there always are, rumours of gold in the mounds. But she did know a bit about archaeology, and I think really her curiosity was tickled, and she was wealthy enough to be able to open them and just have a look.
Mrs. Pretty contacted Ipswich Museum, and they in turn suggested an archaeologist named Basil Brown.
He literally rolled up at her door one day and presented himself, and that's how it all began.
Basil Brown had a real passion for investigating monuments. Assisted by Mrs. Pretty's gardener and gamekeeper, Brown carried out the delicate task of excavating the site. Just a few weeks of painstaking work on Mound 1 revealed the impression of a ship which had long since rotted away.
Somebody else less skillful would have charged straight through that, but Basil's very clever excavation did actually reveal the impression of the boat left in the sand, the sort of shadow boat.
The boat simply got bigger and bigger and bigger. This is as big as the Scandinavian ships, you know. So he was very aware, I think, during the excavation of the ship, that he was into something very, very special.
Whispers about the discovery began to get out, and soon the authorities were involved. Charles Phillips, a Cambridge academic, visited the site and was dumbstruck by what he saw. The burial chamber was yet to be opened and was clearly unrobbed. Phillips felt it was not appropriate work for one man, a gardener and a chauffeur. He took over the excavation, which was to become the richest archaeological find in British history.
It must have been absolutely overwhelming for the excavating team at that stage. I don't think they'd anticipated, how could they have done anything quite like this, because nothing quite like this had ever been found in Britain before. There are other rich graves, but this was really quite spectacular. And I think they were, in a sense, almost shell-shocked by the rapidity and the extraordinary variety and wealth of the material that was coming out of this burial chamber.
It came like a bolt out of the blue. Suddenly, here's a window on a world. You know, this barbaric, splendid burial, overflowing with extraordinary treasures.
Weapons, gold and garnet jewellery, and of course containers, quite a lot of containers, imported silver, drinking horns, drinking vessels, everything. I mean, shoes, buckles. If you could put together a kind of life for an Anglo-Saxon king, there's not much there that you would actually want to add to it.
By July 1939, it was obvious that this was a site of utmost importance. But the growing spectre of the coming war meant the excavation team was under immense pressure to work quickly.
The whole time they were working, they were very aware that war could break out the next day. And so it was, you can almost look at it as a form of a rescue excavation, in a sense, so that it was quite amazing what they achieved.
I'm sure part of the special nature of that sense of urgency was the growing realisation as they excavated this extraordinary assemblage that it was here, in some sense, an emblem of English kingship. There was a very resonant, symbolic thing for the time in which it was excavated, absolutely.
On the 28th of July 1939, the team made perhaps the most momentous discovery of all: the rusted pieces of an iron helmet.
I'm standing right above the spot where the helmet was found. It was smashed into tiny fragments, and that tells us that the helmet itself must have been rusted and corroded at the time that the burial chamber collapsed, which means that the burial chamber must have been a very massive and sturdy structure. It had to support the weight of the mound on top of it and survive long enough for the helmet to rust away. And then, of course, it all collapsed and the helmet was broken into tiny pieces.
These pieces have been painstakingly put back together to form this terrifying helmet. Although it is made of iron, it was once covered in tinned bronze panels. This replica helmet shows how it would have glittered in battle. It was highly decorated, with scenes of a horseman riding over a fallen soldier, and these dancing warriors with their spears and semicircular headdresses. The face mask has human features, a cast bronze mouth, nose, and eyebrows. Look closer still, and you will see that each eyebrow ends in a boar's head with pointed tusks, and at each end of the crest there is a dragon head with sharp little teeth.
The degree of detail in that face mask, the garnets that pick out the eyebrows, the little sort of toothbrush moustache over the mouth, I mean, all this stuff is quite extraordinary. It's almost as though they are trying to present a portrait of the man who is behind it. And of course, it is extraordinary that when you actually wear the helmet, or wear the replica, it also actually enhances your voice. It actually makes the voice echo and drop in tone, so that too would actually give the wearer some extra sort of persona, if you like. They're quite sinister, these helmets.
The big question was, who would have worn it? The particular conditions of Mound 1 meant that there was nothing left of the person who was laid to rest there.
You have to imagine the ship buried in the ground is like a container for water. So water percolating down through the mound would collect in the burial chamber in the boat, and it would be quite acidic because it's filtered through this sandy soil, and you have to imagine a body basically lying in what is in effect an acid bath. And so the body and all the bones dissolved away over many years, leaving only a few chemical traces behind. So that's why no body or bone was discovered.
There may not have been a body, but the artifacts gave some strong clues as to whose grave this might have been. In this letter to Mrs. Pretty, Thomas Kendrick from the British Museum suggests it was someone very special indeed.
There is no doubt that the man in your barrow must have been a very important person, and we are beginning to wonder if he was King Redwald of East Anglia.
King Redwald had ruled in the early 7th century. If Kendrick was right, then it meant that the ship burial had taken place nearly 1,400 years ago.
Well, if you look at all the assemblage together, and if you look at the contenders for the burial, you can make a personal choice. I mean, you can never say that this is the burial of X. But given the gold and garnet jewellery, the assemblage, given the date of the coins, and given the possibility that the burial could have taken place within a decade of those coins coming together, say in the mid-620s, then you could argue for Redwald.
Almost all we know about King Redwald comes from this 8th century manuscript, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by the Anglo-Saxon monk known as the Venerable Bede.
Redwald has a particular place in English history because, according to Bede, a number of these early English kings held a special sway over the southern English peoples. They were kings who ruled other kings. And Bede says they held an imperium, which is the Latin word meaning a kind of empire, wide rule. In Anglo-Saxon, this appears as Bretwalda or Brittenwelda. The lavishness of the grave, and even conceivably some of the symbolism of the artifacts, could suggest that it's him. That dating is spot on.
Some of the things in the grave were incredibly valuable, but they also had a significance over and above their material worth. This great gold belt buckle weighs just over 400 grams of gold, which new research shows was the equivalent of 300 Anglo-Saxon shillings.
Now, what's even more significant about that is the fact that 300 shillings, we know from the law codes of the time, is the life price of a nobleman. It was the amount that had to be paid in compensation to settle the feud if a nobleman was slain. What this meant was that the man who was able to wear this great gold buckle would have been able to sit in a hall surrounded by noblemen, but with the price of the life of any single one of those simply sitting on his belt.
The goods within this grave were certainly fit for a king.
Nothing like a crown was worn by those early kings. The first example of what we would call a crown with kind of prongs comes from the 10th century. Then it was the sword and the helmet which defined the monarchy.
This is an enormous amount of wealth that's going into the ground. Absolutely superb material. There is nothing anywhere else in this period to touch the quality of that jewellery. And yet this is something that this family, the royal family in East Anglia, could afford to discard into the ground. Of course, it was an act of honour and homage to the dead man, but it also says, you know, we are so rich, we still have more of this behind.
Even treasured heirlooms were placed in the chamber. The animal interlace patterns on the helmet suggest it was about 100 years old when it was buried. What's more, there was an intriguing feature to its back.
The helmet has repair on it, so that suggests that it had a bit of use before it was put in the grave.
It is impossible to know, finally, if this helmet was worn in battle. But although it is quite delicate with its silver work and garnet inlay, there is no doubt that this was a functional piece of armour.
It would be possible to wear it as it's got nostrils so that you can breathe when you're wearing it. It's quite stifling, actually, to put the replica on, but it would be possible. And of course, you then have to wonder, did your king go into battle? There's no reason why it shouldn't have been worn, and it would have made an amazing figurehead.
We know that King Redwald fought at least once in the Battle of the River Idle. In his 8th century manuscript, Bede tells us that Redwald massed his troops and marched the 256 miles to Northumbria to face his enemy Ethelfrith in the year 616. Although Redwald defeated his enemy in the north, he lost his son Regan here in the battle.
Because warfare was an aristocratic occupation, of course, the casualties were very heavy in the aristocracy if you lost. Redwald himself conceivably may have died in battle, we just don't know.
At first sight, the grave seemed to have strong Scandinavian links. Ship burials like this have only been found in Suffolk and Sweden. The helmet looked Swedish too, like this one, the Vendel 14 helmet from Uppland with its ear flaps and eyebrows. But a closer look at the Sutton Hoo helmet showed some important differences.
The Sutton Hoo helmet has been raised from a piece of iron, just hammered up. The cap is in one whole piece, whereas the construction of the Swedish helmets show that they were made from several different bands of iron. And therefore, we now think it's possible that the helmet was actually made in England.
An English helmet may be, but one crowded with images taken from Scandinavian mythology, like these dancing warrior panels. Each warrior is dragging a foot and holds spears and a short sword.
They seem to be doing some kind of ritual movement. Of course, they could be fighting, but we do have parallels for that in Scandinavia. So this is obviously a motif.
I think what we're looking at here is a repertoire of images, and clearly they're very potent images of power. You have warriors on a helmet, and clearly successful warriors, and they must be to do with the mythology and the traditions and the conferring of power and success in battle.
There was one other group of mighty warriors who influenced this helmet. The Romans had left Britain at the beginning of the 5th century, but their influence was still being felt a century or two later. This fallen warrior design, where the man on horseback is riding over the conquered enemy, has its roots in the Roman period, and the helmet shape itself borrows heavily from Roman parade helmets.
These early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are really interesting because, as far as we can tell, they were just successful warriors who established their dynasties in Britain, having migrated from Scandinavia in the late Roman period. Of course, later on, when they became powerful, these kings like Offa in Mercia, who built the great dike between England and Wales, or these people in East Anglia, they like to claim that they had a great descent going back even to kings before.
The dynasty goes back to Caesar and then ultimately to Woden. Having a Germanic god as the progenitor of your dynasty is not uncommon, actually, amongst the early Anglo-Saxon dynasties. But it's very interesting that the East Anglian genealogy also includes Caesar in it. And that, to me, is really rather interesting because one of the strands in this extraordinary burial is a strand which seems to be saying we are the heirs of Rome. The helmet itself is based on a Roman parade helmet, very clearly. So that in itself is a sort of evocation of the Roman past. So the fact that Caesar appears in the genealogy, I think, is no accident at all.
They come from the pagan world of Odin and Thor, Woden and Freya, and these pagan gods of war and storm in the Viking northern world that we're familiar with later, you know. But they also adopt Roman ideas of rulership, of kingship, perhaps, some of the symbolism of their kingship, and subsequently, of course, Roman religion and Latin culture.
The late Roman inheritance included Christianity. Bede tells us that a missionary landed on the island of Thanet in Kent in 597.
He talks about King Redwald, who spent quite a bit of time in Kent and would therefore have come into contact with Christianity there, having adopted Christianity, but on returning to his kingdom had reverted to paganism, or at least had gone halfway back to being a pagan, because he had altars, according to Bede, placed side by side, one to Christ and one to the devil, which presumably meant the Germanic god Woden. So Redwald seems to have been backing two horses at that time.
It's possible that the family of the dead man also decided to back two horses when they came to assemble the grave goods. Although it was a pagan burial with provision made for the pagan afterlife, 2 silver baptismal spoons with the Greek inscriptions Solos and Paulos were also included.
Baptismal spoons, of course, are given at conversion and baptism, you know, and these had, it seemed, Solos and Paulos, Saul and Paul, you know, the famous conversion of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. And even though he converted back to paganism and was buried in a pagan graveyard, his family nevertheless buried these things with him.
The spoons, with their Greek inscriptions, were found at the right shoulder of where the body might have lain. The pagan helmet was at the left shoulder. The helmet does not contain any Christian symbolism. In contrast, this 8th century helmet found in York carries an emphatic Christian message. Its crest forms a cross shape, and there is a Latin inscription, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit and God, to all we say, Amen."
That Christian inscription on the York helmet is perhaps doing what these extraordinary totemic images or mythological images, whatever they are doing on the Sutton Hoo helmet. The Christian invocation, the Christian prayer on the York helmet is bringing protection to its wearer, and so I think perhaps these fascinating animal images on the crest and on the face mask of the Sutton Hoo helmet might be doing for the wearer of the Sutton Hoo helmet.
The discovery of the Sutton Hoo treasure turned Anglo-Saxon scholarship on its head, bringing with it a new understanding of how sophisticated their culture was.
Just by looking at this grave assemblage, we realised that there were international connections, that goods and probably also people could travel very long distances and very far beyond their own cultures. If you look at the eyebrows, the garnets used on those may have come from as far away as India or Sri Lanka. So you see that the materials themselves had travelled quite a long distance before reaching Anglo-Saxon England.
What's more, it seemed to prove something that few people dared to believe was possible. It gave a reality to that great masterpiece of early English literature, the epic poem Beowulf, which described the great deeds and death of a heroic king from the 7th century.
There's a great description in Beowulf of the helmet, Sehwita helm, the white shining helm, maybe it's silvered or whatever, made by the mastery of a gold master who worked wonders so long ago. You know, this is the world of Beowulf.
In the poem, it's referred to the fact that the helmet has got what is called a walla. It is something that is wirum bewundum, wound with wire, and it somehow goes around the helmet. Well, we didn't have any idea what that was until it was realised that this would fit exactly as a description, the crest that we have on the Sutton Hoo helmet.
The discovery of the treasure in July 1939 made headline news. Interest in it only intensified when a treasure trove inquiry decided that everything from the grave belonged to Mrs. Pretty, who had funded the excavation and on whose land it had been found. In an act of unparalleled generosity, she promptly gave all this extraordinary treasure to the British Museum. She was offered the honour of Dame of the British Empire, but refused it. Within a fortnight of the treasure trove inquest, war had broken out. Amazingly, scenes like this were played out on the burial mound.
Once war was declared, this area, which is called Sutton Heath, was used for battle practice, and the tanks and Bren gun carriers drove all over these mounds. During the time when it was used for battle practices, actually tanks drove right through the ship, so when it was re-excavated you could actually see where the tanks' tracks had driven over the remains of the ship.
London too was under attack, and the British Museum moved many of its treasures to a London underground station. The helmet, still in over 500 pieces, was boxed up and stored here. At the end of the war, the huge job began of piecing it back together, which took 2 years. This was the outcome which was proudly displayed in the Festival of Britain in 1951.
I declare the Festival of Britain open and wish it a universal success.
The Festival of Britain was absolutely an act of regeneration after the war, and it was there to say, look, here we are, we're back in business, this is what we stand for, these are British values, this is our British history, this is our past, and it's something which we should be very proud of.
There in ration book Britain, rather pinched, this artefact was displayed. And an artefact which, in the conventional narrative of English history and even British history, represented a kind of beginning, you know. The story of the monarchy leading into the story of the empire all went back to this.
Despite all the attention the helmet was getting, There was a growing sense of unease about the way it had been put back together. It didn't actually function as a helmet, and the sides of the face and the throat would have been left completely unprotected.
More than that, because the crest and the terminal dragon overlapped the neck guard wasn't flexible, which would have meant that when you wore it, you were like almost imprisoned in it. All these things gradually led to the helmet being dismantled and then being put together again, which was like opening a little box of horrors.
In 1971, the reassembling started, and British Museum conservator Nigel Williams was given the job. For over 6 months, the helmet lay in over 500 fragments on Williams' work table. A colleague remembers the blood, sweat and frustrations involved.
He was an optimistic man. He probably thought, 3 weeks I'll have something to show. It was really quite wrong. It took him a very long time. And what slowed him up, of course, was everything. It was such an important helmet that pretty well everything had to be discussed. This does slow you down. You can't just go at it. Although I do remember Nigel saying to him, I wish these people would get out of my room and let me get on with it.
Then an astounding breakthrough was made. In a box marked head, he found the jaw of a dragon head, similar to those at either end of the crest. It hadn't been used on the original reconstruction.
That little head lay around for a while. At that time, I think he'd been looking at it for about 8 months. So gradually, you begin to absorb, sort of subconsciously, the shapes of things. And it's when your eye catches one and looks at another, suddenly you say, that'll fit there. I mean, you almost know, you pick it up and it'll go. You very nearly don't need to try it. Yeah, it'll fit there, yes. Right, ding, oh, it does.
This third dragon head is a perfect fit between the eyebrows, interlocking with the other elements of the face. It also revealed another layer of symbolism in the helmet. Suddenly, the features of the face mask materialized into the shape of a winged dragon. The eyebrows appear as wings, while the nose and moustache form the body and the tail.
This is at once a human face and yet a face which has animal strengths embodied in the symbolism of this mask, and which is also not only something which embodies the power of the wearer, but perhaps also terrifies the seer.
I think the helmet has become an icon. That helmet has a sort of reality for people because they can look at it and see the early 7th century, see those early Anglo-Saxon warriors and how they perceived themselves.
Nearly 1,500 years after it was made, the Sutton Hoo helmet has taken its place in the British Museum as one of its supreme treasures. Discovered on the eve of war, it became a symbol of the nation and proof of a forgotten, sophisticated civilization. It's an object in the museum's collections like no other. We may never know who made it, and we can't be certain who wore it, but it still has the power to make us think again about our nation.